Hello, my name's Robert Cook, and today I'll be sharing some history on jazz education in the United States. So, setting the scene for jazz education prior to jazz's inception in the 1900s, uh, instrumental music was starting to become established in the United States. As early as 1896, with the creation of the first school orchestras in New London, Connecticut, and Wichita, Kansas, and the creation of the first high school band at Hughes High School in Cincinnati, Ohio, 1919. Instrumental music education has been a large part of American music education since then. Uh, this was caused, or the popularity of these groups and then the growing desire for it to be a part of education was mostly caused by touring orchestras and bands such as the Theodore Thomas Orchestra, which toured the country and brought quality instrumental European art music to the United States for the first time, and other band ensembles such as Gilmore's and Sousa's entertained the public and performed dances and other forms of entertainment to meet the needs of the public. There was also the use of military bands in World War I and II, which helped establish bands across the country. However, public interests began to shift in the first 2 decades of the 20th century in favor of small jazz dance bands, and these dance bands took over public musical entertainment. It's natural then that jazz bands would eventually follow the trend that orchestras and concert bands set in place and eventually move from popular public attention to predominantly educational usage. And what follows is a compilation of the history of jazz education in the United States. Most recorded history focuses on education in formal settings, such as schools or religious organizations, although for some musical traditions, a considerable amount of learning happens informally or goes undocumented. The narrative of jazz education often begins at North Texas State College, where the first jazz degree was offered in 1947. However, more recent historians have been concerned with documenting education from the 1900s up to the 1940s, before it was established institutionally. The prehistoric era of jazz education started in the 1920s and 1930s and has often been labeled as an orally transmitted tradition, which is likely due to the little documentation available from this period. Although it is documented that W.C. Handy taught jazz music at historically black colleges as early as 1900, Lynn Bowden also taught jazz classes at historically black colleges throughout the 1920s and 30s. And later, he went on to teach 5,000 black musicians jazz and dance music at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center during World War II. Jazz education was not offered at universities during the 1920s and 1930s, but many jazz musicians and big band leaders were music school graduates and studied European classical theory, contrary to what the oral tradition uh, storyline has portrayed jazz as. The great Bird, Charlie Parker, studied in Paris. Others like Coleman Hawkins and Fletcher Henderson had great theoretical knowledge from their time in universities as well. And there were some musicians like Louis Armstrong and Jimmy Harrison that were by ear players. But the notion that the entire history of jazz as a completely oral tradition is not true. Many jazz musicians were well educated and understood what they were doing and taught others what they were doing. It is also important to note that jazz records recordings may have served as the early textbooks for the profession. For just like textbooks, they are a medium of transmission between the composer or performer and the player and the learner, which could be how the profession progressed for some time without any university or institutional documentation. As presented earlier, the dance bands in the 1920s through the 1950s were popular. Therefore, universities such as North Texas State College, now the University of North Texas, and the Schillinger House in Boston, now the Berklee School of Music, likely capitalized on this popularity by offering jazz studies degrees in order to attract students to their institutions. And with the end of World War II, there was a large body of military band musicians with access to the GI Bill, which could have been attracted to their universities, which made for an easy pitch to school boards for the inclusion of jazz studies degrees. At the same time, bebop was rising in the 1940s as a result of theoretical study from many of the great musicians discussed earlier. And in most cases, this era defined the theoretical language of jazz that would later carry on to the present. In the 1950s, jazz theory was starting to form in an effort to bridge the gap between an oral tradition and academic music. George Russell, a composer, drummer, and friend of Miles Davis, was revolutionary in the creation of jazz chord scale theory, which he coined Davis as the creator. Russell's contributions to the field will be discussed in more depth later, but the simplest definition of this chord scale theory is that every type of chord has a related scale rooted in the traditions of Western art music, which was a revolutionary pedagogical concept at the time and had only ever been transmitted orally between jazz musicians. In the late 1950s, other prominent jazz artists such as Dizzy Gillespie, Kenny Dorham, and John Lewis held a series of summer camps in jazz called the Lenox School of Jazz, in which notable future artists and educators such as Ornette Coleman, David Baker, and Jamie Aebersold were students. The first jazz clinic was created by Stan Kenton in 1959 at Indiana University and Michigan State University. And then other big band leaders like Woody Herman and Maynard Ferguson offered clinics at high schools and colleges in a similar fashion after Kenton's example. And thanks to all of these educational efforts and public affairs sort of concerts and public school performances from all these great jazz artists, the scene was set for jazz in academia to really take off in the 1960s and 70s, which it did. Now, the reason for, aside from these promotions from other jazz artists, the civil rights movement was a huge contributor to setting the scene for jazz to get a firm foothold in tertiary education. The civil rights movement began with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 and gained significant traction in the United States during the 1960s, the promoting the desegregation of communities. Multicultural music, including jazz, gained traction as popular opinion began to shift in favor of the inclusion of minority history, music, and arts in education. The Tanglewood Symposium in 1967 was held as a direct response to this value reversal that students and civil rights protests were promoting. The symposium participants declared that music of all periods, styles, forms, and cultures belongs in the curriculum. The musical repertoire should be expanded to involve music of our time in its rich variety, including currently popular teen age music and avant garde music, American folk music, and music of other cultures. Shortly after the symposium, Stan Kenton and other participants established the National Association of Jazz Education, later the International Association of Jazz Education. And jazz educators and performers capitalized on the new opportunities of social change to gain a permanent foothold in tertiary education. Between 1960 and 1970, the number of college jazz bands grew from 30 to 450. And from 1964 to 1974, the number of institutions that offered jazz degrees rose from 41 to 228. This showed the extent of public enthusiasm for the inclusion of more ethnic music like jazz in schools and established jazz as an important part of music education. At the same time as the civil rights movement was in its infancy, jazz theory was beginning to take shape as well, like discussed earlier. In 1953, George Russell published a pamphlet on chord scale theory entitled The Lydian Chromatic Concept of Tonal Organization. This would later be turned into a full book, and it was the first published jazz contribution to music theory. These were not necessarily Russell's own ideas, but a compilation of concepts that great jazz musicians like Davis, Coltrane, Coleman, and Hancock of the 1950s and 60s were already using. George Russell then went on to teach these concepts to students like David Baker, and David Baker went on to teach these same concepts to his student, Jamie Aebersold. Aebersold contributed to the creation and establishment of an entire pedagogic system for jazz education, which became widely accepted across universities in the United States by 1979. He published 131 volumes of method books that included a new practice tool called the play along track. The first volume was published in 1967. The play along track was a melodyless track with a rhythm section that allowed students to practice improvisation freely without the need for a rhythm section, which many students did not have access to. He also encouraged pattern playing in his volumes, which was a common learning tool used by his colleagues Jerry Coker and David Baker, as well as other great performers before and during that time period. Finally, he expanded on George Russell's chord scale theory by creating a scale syllabus in 1975. The scale syllabus was a revolutionary tool that cemented chord scale theory as the basis of jazz theory to present day. Jamie Aebersold, Coker, and Baker also offered a bunch of clinics and summer camps throughout the 1970s and created other publications on method books for teaching jazz improvisation, which also contributed greatly to the field. Today, or after this, by 1980, 70% of junior and high school band programs had big band or jazz ensemble offerings. And in 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act included arts as a core subject, which is significant for music education in general, for this was the first time that the federal government had included the arts as a core subject. The status of the arts as a core subject gave Mincy ground to advocate for the arts with school boards across the nation, stating that the arts had received $30 million in funding from the federal government and should not be cut from programs. Also, since then, in 2006, the College Music Society reported that 1,400 colleges and universities offered jazz degrees, and 33 offered graduate degrees in jazz studies. Because of this, Martin and Walters have stated that jazz education has become firmly established as an important part of the musical curriculum in higher education. The importance of the No Child Left Behind Act and Mincy's advocacy cannot be understated for jazz education because it generally promoted all music education to be included and helped maintain its inclusion throughout the early 2000s and 1900s. But especially with the No Child Left Behind Act being passed and arts not being included as a tested subject, some organization or many school boards elected to get rid of arts programs. But Mincy's advocacy helped to keep music in schools and thus keep jazz in schools. And then in 2008, the International Association of Jazz Education dissolved, but in that same year, the Jazz Education Network, JEN, was created by founders Mary Jo Papich and Dr. Lou Fisher. Since its creation, JEN has offered a yearly research journal, which is called the Jazz Education and Research and Practice, and it hosts an annual conference each year in January since 2010. The organization offers scholarships, a young composer showcase, the Educational Generations Jazz Festival, expands jazz education with the Jazz 2U program, which goes to schools that don't have programs, and promotes jazz education as well as serves as a network for research and discourse in jazz today. I thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope that this was educational and helped everyone learn more about jazz education's history in the United States. What was once an undocumented popular art form has grown into a fully fledged staple of music education that embraces the multicultural makeup of our country and contributes to the broader field of music education with its own unique perspectives and research goals. Thank you.